The open road promises freedom and adventure. But for these 11 travelers, their journeys became waking nightmares. From a marketing coordinator stalked across 3 states by the same mysterious vehicle, to a retired teacher who followed an emergency broadcast straight into a dangerous cult's hands, these true stories will make you think twice about your next road trip. Tonight, on Verified Fears, you'll hear accounts of GPS systems leading people into deadly traps, helpful strangers who knew impossible details about their victims, and towns that refused to let visitors leave. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell to join the Verified Fears community, because once you hear these 11 terrifying road trip experiences, you'll never look at an empty highway the same way again. My name is Conrad, and I still check my rearview mirror obsessively every time I drive anywhere, even just to the grocery store 3 blocks from my house. What happened to me 2 years ago on Interstate 80 changed everything about how I see the road, and honestly, I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe driving alone again, especially at night. I keep telling myself I should probably share this story because maybe it'll help someone else recognize the signs before it's too late. But every time I start talking about it, my hands shake and my voice gets all weird. My therapist says talking about it more will help, so here goes nothing. I was driving back to my apartment in Denver after spending the weekend with some college buddies in Iowa. Just a normal road trip that I'd done probably 15 times before without any issues. I'm 26, work in marketing for a small tech company, and I've always been pretty logical about things, you know? I don't jump to conclusions. I don't panic easily, and I definitely don't believe in conspiracy theories or paranormal stuff. But what happened that night tested every rational thought I'd ever had about random coincidences and innocent explanations. I left my friend's place around 6 in the evening, figuring I'd drive through the night and get home by morning, maybe catch a few hours of sleep before work on Monday. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, not too much traffic, just the way I like it for long drives. I had my playlist ready, a thermos of coffee, and enough snacks to keep me alert for the 8-hour journey ahead. Everything was completely normal for the first couple hours. I was making good time, singing along to my music, thinking about the weekend and how good it felt to reconnect with the guys from college. We'd played some video games, watched movies, ordered way too much pizza. Just typical stuff that made me feel like I was 20 again, instead of pushing 30 with a mortgage and a job that stressed me out more than I wanted to admit. The sun was setting behind me, painting the sky these incredible shades of orange and pink. And I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt. That's when I first noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. But honestly, I didn't think anything of it at first because, it's an interstate highway and there are cars everywhere during normal driving hours. But as the evening wore on and traffic started thinning out, those same headlights were still there. Not close enough to be tailgating or anything threatening, just consistently about a quarter mile behind me, matching my speed perfectly. I told myself it was just another long-distance driver heading in the same direction, probably someone else trying to get home from a weekend trip. Nothing unusual about that at all. I even felt a little solidarity with whoever it was. Like we were both in this together, 2 people pushing through the night to get back to our real lives. But then I started paying more attention, and that's when things got weird. When I sped up to pass a slow-moving truck, the headlights sped up too. When I slowed down because I thought I saw a cop car on the shoulder, the headlights slowed down too. When I moved to the left lane, they moved to the left lane. When I moved back to the right, they followed. I started timing it, and I swear the other car would change lanes exactly 30 seconds after I did. Like they were trying not to make it obvious, but couldn't help following my exact route. My logical brain kept making excuses, though. Maybe it was just someone who noticed I seemed to know where the speed traps were and decided to follow my lead. Maybe they figured I was a local who knew the best lanes for making good time. Maybe it was just a series of coincidences that seemed more significant because I was tired and letting my imagination run wild. I tried to push it out of my mind and focus on the road, but every time I checked my mirrors, there they were, maintaining that same exact distance, like they were connected to my car by an invisible rope. Around 10:30, I needed gas and decided to test my theory. There was a truck stop coming up at the next exit, one of those big places with multiple gas stations and restaurants and a bunch of parking for long-haul truckers. I signaled early and took the exit, watching my rearview mirror the whole time. The headlights followed me down the ramp. My heart started beating faster, but I told myself they probably needed gas too. That truck stops are where everyone stops on long road trips. That I was being paranoid for no reason. I pulled up to a pump on the far side of the station, choosing a spot where I could see the entrance and keep an eye on what was happening. The other car didn't pull up to a pump, though. Instead, it parked across the lot near the building, far enough away that I couldn't see the make or model clearly, but close enough that whoever was inside had a perfect view of me. I filled up my tank as slowly as possible, trying to get a better look at the other vehicle. But the lights from the gas station were creating too much glare on their windshield for me to see inside. It looked like a dark sedan, maybe black or dark blue. Nothing particularly distinctive about it that I could tell from that distance. I went inside to pay and buy another coffee, taking my time, hoping they'd give up whatever game they were playing and just drive away. I even went to the bathroom and bought some chips I didn't want, killing probably 20 minutes total. When I came back out, they were still there, still parked in the same spot, still watching. That's when the rational part of my brain finally shut up and the scared part took over. Because there was no innocent explanation for someone sitting in a truck stop parking lot for 20 minutes without getting gas or going inside. I got back in my car and sat there for a minute, trying to decide what to do. I could call the police, but what would I tell them? That someone was driving behind me on a public highway and then stopped at the same truck stop? That wasn't exactly a crime, and I didn't even have a license plate number or a good description of the driver. I could wait them out, just sit there until they left first. But what if they were planning to wait me out too? What if this was some kind of sick game to them, and they had more patience than I did? What if they were hoping I'd be too tired to drive safely after sitting around for hours? I decided to get back on the highway and see what happened. Maybe try a different exit in a few miles and see if they followed me there too. Sure enough, within 2 minutes of me pulling back onto I-80, the headlights were behind me again. Same distance, same steady pace. But now I was actively scared instead of just curious, and being scared made me notice things I'd missed before. Like how they'd dim their headlights whenever we passed other cars, as if they didn't want anyone else to see them clearly. Like how they'd hang back a little further whenever we went through construction zones with concrete barriers. As if they knew those were places where I might try to escape or get help. Like how they seemed to anticipate my lane changes now, moving over almost before I did. As if they'd been studying my driving patterns for hours and could predict what I was going to do next. I tried everything I could think of to lose them, or at least confirm they were deliberately following me. I took random exits and got right back on the highway. They followed. I pulled into rest areas and waited. They waited too, always parking where they could see me, but far enough away that I couldn't see them clearly. I tried sudden lane changes and unexpected speed variations. They matched everything perfectly. I even tried calling my friend Jake and asking him to stay on the phone with me. But when I tried to explain what was happening, it sounded crazy even to me. How do you tell someone that you're being followed by a car that's not actually doing anything illegal or threatening, just driving behind you on a public road? Jake tried to be supportive, but I could tell he thought I was overthinking things, maybe getting paranoid because I was tired. By 2 in the morning, I'd been dealing with this for over 4 hours, and I was starting to panic in a way I'd never experienced before. My hands were sweating so much I could barely grip the steering wheel. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over my music. And I kept checking my mirrors so obsessively that I was probably more dangerous to other drivers than whoever was following me. I started thinking about all the true crime podcasts I'd listened to. All the stories about people who disappeared on lonely highways. All the statistics about how many murders happen in remote areas where no one can hear you scream. I kept telling myself that if they wanted to hurt me, they would have done something by now. But then I'd remember reading about killers who like to psychologically torture their victims first, who got off on the fear and helplessness as much as the actual violence. That's when I decided to try something desperate. There was a small town coming up, and instead of staying on the interstate, I took the exit and started driving through residential neighborhoods, making random turns, hoping to either lose them in the maze of suburban streets or attract enough attention that someone would call the police about suspicious vehicles driving around at 3 in the morning. For a few minutes, I thought it worked. I couldn't see the headlights behind me anymore, and I started to breathe normally for the first time in hours. I found a 24-hour diner and pulled into the parking lot, thinking I'd go inside and sit there until sunrise, maybe call someone to come pick me up and leave my car there until daylight. But as I sat in the parking lot, trying to calm down and figure out my next move, I saw them again. The same headlights, creeping slowly down the street past the diner, not stopping but definitely looking. They'd found me again, even after all those random turns. Even in a town they couldn't possibly know better than I did. That's when I realized this wasn't random, wasn't coincidence, wasn't someone who just happened to be going in the same direction. This was deliberate, planned, purposeful. Someone had chosen me specifically, had been tracking my movements for hours, had probably been planning this for longer than I wanted to think about. I sat in that diner until the sun came up, too scared to go back to my car, too scared to drive home alone, too scared to do anything except drink coffee and try not to have a complete breakdown in front of the waitress who kept asking if I was okay. When there was finally enough daylight to see clearly, I called my brother and asked him to drive out and escort me home. I never saw that car again, never figured out who was driving it or why they chose me or what they were planning to do. But I know it wasn't my imagination, and I know it wasn't innocent. And I know that if I hadn't been careful and paranoid and maybe just lucky, I might not be here to tell this story. My name is Josiah, and I'm 32 years old, divorced with 2 kids who I pick up every other weekend for our custody arrangement. I work construction, been doing it for about 8 years now, and I'm usually pretty good at handling myself in tough situations, you know? I've worked job sites in some rough neighborhoods, dealt with all kinds of people, and I've never been the type to get scared easily. But what happened to me 6 months ago on a Saturday night in Detroit still gives me nightmares, and I can't drive through that part of the city anymore without my hands shaking. I keep telling myself I should have known better than to take that shortcut, should have just stuck to the main roads even if it meant being late to pick up my kids. But hindsight doesn't help much when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning, replaying every terrifying minute of that night. I was driving from my apartment on the east side to my ex-wife's place in the suburbs to pick up Emma and Tyler for our weekend together. It's normally about a 45-minute drive. Nothing complicated, just straight shots on major roads that I've driven hundreds of times since the divorce. But that Saturday, there was some kind of accident on the freeway that had traffic backed up for miles. And I was already running 20 minutes late because I'd gotten caught up watching a football game and lost track of time. My ex-wife Jennifer gets really annoyed when I'm late. And she'd already sent me 3 texts asking where I was and reminding me that the kids had plans on Sunday morning that I couldn't make them miss. I was stressed about disappointing the kids and giving Jennifer another reason to lecture me about responsibility. So when I saw an exit that looked like it might cut through some side streets and get me there faster, I took it without really thinking about where I was going. The GPS on my phone immediately started recalculating, and I figured it would guide me through whatever neighborhood I'd stumbled into and get me back on track toward Jennifer's place. But as soon as I got off the freeway, I realized I was in a part of Detroit that I'd never seen before, even though I'd lived in the area my whole life. The streetlights were mostly burned out, half the buildings looked abandoned, and there was trash everywhere, like no one had picked up garbage in months. I've worked construction in plenty of rough neighborhoods, but this felt different. More desperate somehow. Like a place where bad things happened regularly, and no one cared enough to do anything about it. I started second-guessing my decision to take the shortcut. But the GPS was telling me to keep going straight. So I figured I'd just follow its directions and get out of there as quickly as possible. That's when my car started making this weird grinding noise from somewhere under the hood, like metal scraping against metal. I'd been meaning to take it to a mechanic for a tune-up, but construction work doesn't pay enough to spend money on preventive maintenance when the car still runs. So I'd been putting it off until something actually broke. Well, something had finally broken. And of course it happened in the worst possible place, at the worst possible time. The grinding got louder and louder, and then the engine just died completely, right in the middle of a street that looked like it belonged in a post-apocalyptic movie. No streetlights, no traffic, no signs of life except for a few windows, with flickering lights that could have been candles or just old televisions. I tried starting the car again, but nothing happened. Not even the sound of the engine turning over. The battery was fine because the radio and lights still worked, but whatever had been making that grinding noise had killed the engine completely. I sat there for a minute, trying to figure out what to do. I could call a tow truck, but I didn't even know what street I was on, and most tow companies won't come into certain parts of the city after dark anyway. I could call Jennifer and ask her to come pick me up, but she'd never let me hear the end of it, and I'd probably lose my weekend with the kids. I could walk back to the freeway and try to find help there. But it was already past 9 o'clock, and I hadn't seen any open businesses or gas stations on my way in. That's when I noticed the fog. It hadn't been foggy when I left my apartment, and the weather report hadn't mentioned anything about fog. But suddenly there was this thick, gray mist rolling down the street like something out of a horror movie. Within minutes, I could barely see 20 feet in any direction, and the few streetlights that had been working were now just dim glows in the darkness. I'd never seen fog that thick in Detroit, especially not in October, and it seemed to be getting thicker by the minute. The temperature had dropped too, from a comfortable 60 degrees to something that felt like it was barely above freezing, and I could see my breath when I exhaled. I decided I didn't have much choice but to start walking and hope I could find help before I froze to death or got completely lost in the fog. I locked my car, even though there wasn't much worth stealing in it, and started walking back in the direction I'd come from, trying to retrace my route to the freeway. But the fog was so thick I couldn't see street signs or landmarks, and all the buildings looked the same in the dim light. Just dark shapes looming out of the mist like abandoned monuments to urban decay. I'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow and deliberate, like someone was following me but trying not to make too much noise. I turned around, but I couldn't see anyone through the fog. Just shadows moving in and out of the gray mist like ghosts. I stopped walking and listened, and the footsteps stopped too. I started walking again, faster this time, and the footsteps started again, matching my pace exactly. My construction work has taught me to pay attention to my surroundings and trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. And every instinct I had was screaming that I needed to get out of there as fast as possible. But I was lost in the fog, on foot with no idea which direction led to safety and which led deeper into whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. That's when I heard voices, multiple people talking in low tones somewhere ahead of me in the fog. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but something about the way they were talking made my skin crawl, like they were discussing something they didn't want anyone else to hear. I thought about calling out and asking for help, but something told me that would be a very bad idea. So I tried to move quietly and avoid walking directly toward the voices. But the fog was so disorienting that I couldn't tell if I was moving away from them or getting closer, and the sound seemed to be coming from different directions at the same time. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the fog right in front of me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was a man, maybe in his 40s, wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks, and had this wild look in his eyes, like he was high on something or hadn't slept in days. He smiled when he saw me, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that predators give their prey right before they strike. He asked me what I was doing walking around their neighborhood so late at night. And when I explained about my car breaking down, he laughed and said I'd picked the wrong place to have car trouble. He told me his friends would be very interested in meeting me. And that's when I realized the voices I'd been hearing were getting closer, and I could see more shadowy figures moving through the fog toward us. The man reached into his jacket, and I didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. I turned and ran as fast as I could in the opposite direction, crashing through the fog like a blind man, not caring where I was going, as long as it was away from those people. I could hear them shouting behind me and the sound of multiple sets of footsteps chasing after me. But the fog was working in my favor now, making it hard for them to see me, even though it made it hard for me to see where I was going. I ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, stumbling over trash and debris, bouncing off parked cars and fire hydrants, just trying to put as much distance as possible between me and whoever had been chasing me. Eventually, I saw lights ahead through the fog, real electric lights from what looked like a convenience store or gas station. I ran toward the lights like they were the gates of heaven, and when I got there, I found a 24-hour gas station with a clerk behind bulletproof glass who looked at me like I was crazy when I stumbled in bleeding from cuts on my face and arms, breathing hard and covered in sweat despite the cold. I called the police, and when they finally showed up an hour later, they found my car exactly where I'd left it. But they said they'd never heard of anyone having trouble in that particular area, and that it was actually pretty safe compared to other parts of the city. They gave me a ride back to my car, and by then the fog had cleared and the temperature was back to normal, like nothing had ever happened. My car started right up without any problems, like the engine had never made that grinding noise, like it had never broken down at all. The police officers looked at me like I was making the whole thing up, and maybe I was starting to doubt myself too. But I know what I experienced, and I know those people in the fog weren't trying to help me. I never did make it to Jennifer's place that night, and she was furious with me for not showing up and not answering my phone while I was running for my life through that nightmare neighborhood, She accused me of making up stories to cover for the fact that I'd probably been drinking or gotten distracted by something more important than my own children. I couldn't explain what had really happened because I wasn't even sure myself. And I knew she'd never believe me anyway. I lost my weekend with Emma and Tyler, and it was another 2 weeks before Jennifer would let me see them again. I still drive past that exit sometimes on my way to pick up the kids, and I always slow down and look. But I can never find the street I turned down that night. Like it doesn't exist in the daytime, or maybe never existed at all. But I know it was real. And I know I barely made it out of there alive. And I know that sometimes taking shortcuts can lead you places you were never meant to go. My name is Matthias, and I'm 47 years old. Been working as a nurse at Portland General for about 12 years now. I mostly work night shifts in the emergency department, which means I'm used to seeing people at their worst moments, dealing with all kinds of trauma and crisis situations that would probably give most people nightmares. I thought I'd seen everything there was to see about human suffering and bizarre behavior. But what happened to me last October on Highway 26 proved that I still had a lot to learn about how truly disturbing people can be. I've always been the kind of person who tries to help others when I can. Maybe because of my job, or maybe just because that's how my parents raised me. But that night, my compassion almost got me killed. And I still wake up sometimes wondering what would have happened if I just kept driving. It was a Tuesday night, around 4:30 in the morning, and I was driving from my apartment in Northeast Portland to the hospital for my shift that started at 5. It had been raining for 3 days straight. That heavy Pacific Northwest rain that makes everything look gray and depressing. And the roads were slick with water and fallen leaves that made driving more dangerous than usual. I was running a few minutes late because I had overslept, but I wasn't worried because the night shift crew was pretty understanding about traffic delays and weather-related problems. The radio was playing some old jazz music that helped me wake up and get in the right mindset for another 12-hour shift, dealing with whatever emergencies Portland decided to throw at us that night. About halfway to the hospital, I saw a figure standing on the shoulder of the highway, thumb out, clearly hitchhiking despite the terrible weather. It was a woman, maybe in her 30s, wearing a light jacket that was completely soaked through and jeans that looked like they'd been wet for hours. She didn't have an umbrella or any kind of rain gear, and she was shivering so badly I could see it even from my car. My first instinct was to keep driving because picking up hitchhikers, especially at 4:30 in the morning, is obviously not the smartest thing to do. But she looked so miserable and desperate that I felt genuinely sorry for her. I'd been caught in the rain without proper clothes before, and I knew how awful it felt to be cold and wet, with no way to get warm and dry. I pulled over about 50 feet past where she was standing and waited for her to run up to my car. She moved faster than I expected, like she'd been hoping someone would stop but hadn't really believed it would happen. When she got to the passenger side door, I rolled down the window and asked her where she needed to go. She said she was trying to get to the downtown area, somewhere near Pioneer Square, which was basically on my way to the hospital. So I told her to get in. She opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, bringing with her the smell of wet clothes and something else I couldn't identify. Something that reminded me of the antiseptic we used to clean hospital rooms, but stronger and more chemical. The first thing I noticed about her was how pale she was. Not just regular pale, but almost gray. Like someone who'd been sick for a long time or hadn't seen sunlight in months. Her hair was dark brown and plastered to her head from the rain, and her eyes were this unusual light blue color that seemed to reflect the dashboard lights in a weird way. She thanked me for stopping and said most people wouldn't pick up hitchhikers anymore, especially women hitchhiking alone at night. Which was smart of them because you never know who you're dealing with these days. I agreed and said I normally wouldn't stop either. But she looked like she really needed help, and I couldn't just leave someone standing in the rain like that. We drove in silence for a few minutes while she tried to warm up, and I turned up the heat in the car to help her dry off. That's when she started talking, and that's when things began to feel wrong in a way I couldn't explain at first. She asked me if I was Matthew, and I corrected her and said my name was Matthias, which is pretty uncommon, so most people get it wrong. But then she smiled and said she knew that. She was just testing me because she'd heard I was the kind of person who corrected people about small details like that. I asked her how she could have heard anything about me since we'd never met before, and she laughed and said she knew more about me than I might think. She started telling me things about my life that there was no way she could have known. She knew I worked at Portland General, knew I usually worked night shifts, knew I lived in a one-bedroom apartment on Alberta Street with a cat named Oscar. She knew I'd been divorced 3 years ago, knew my ex-wife's name was Rebecca, knew we'd gotten divorced because I was working too many hours and neglecting our relationship. She knew I had a sister in Seattle who was pregnant with her second child, knew my parents had died in a car accident when I was 22, knew I'd gotten into nursing because I wanted to help people the way the hospital staff had helped my parents before they died. I was getting more and more uncomfortable as she kept revealing personal information that she had no legitimate way of knowing. But she wasn't done yet. She knew about the patient I'd lost the week before. An elderly man who'd come into the emergency department with chest pains and died despite everything we did to save him. She knew I'd been having nightmares about that case, knew I'd been questioning whether I was really helping people or just watching them suffer and die. She knew about the bottle of sleeping pills I'd been taking to deal with the stress, knew about the therapy appointments I'd been considering but hadn't made yet because I was too proud to admit I needed help. When I asked her how she could possibly know all these things, she just smiled and said she made it her business to know about people like me. People who thought they were helping others but were really just delaying the inevitable. She said death came for everyone eventually, and people like me who worked in hospitals were just kidding themselves if they thought they were making any real difference. She said she'd been watching me for weeks, learning about my routines and my weaknesses, waiting for the right opportunity to have this conversation. She said she had a message for me from someone I'd lost, but she didn't say who. That's when I realized I needed to get her out of my car as quickly as possible, because whatever was happening wasn't normal and wasn't safe. I told her I needed to stop for gas and that she'd have to get out there. But she said we weren't done talking yet, and that I shouldn't be so eager to end our conversation. She reached over and put her hand on my arm, and her skin was cold. Not just cold from the rain, but cold like someone who'd been dead for hours. Her grip was stronger than it should have been, and when I tried to pull my arm away, she held on tight enough to leave bruises. She told me she had a prediction about my future. Something that was going to happen very soon that would change everything about how I saw my job and my life. She said someone was going to come into the emergency department that night, someone I'd recognize, someone whose life I wouldn't be able to save, no matter how hard I tried. She said I'd realize then that all my years of trying to help people had been pointless, that death always wins in the end, and that I should consider whether it might be better to help people die peacefully instead of fighting a battle that couldn't be won. I managed to pull into a gas station and told her she needed to get out immediately, that I was calling the police if she didn't leave me alone. She laughed and let go of my arm, then opened the passenger door and got out without saying another word. I watched her walk away into the rain, and she moved differently than she had when she'd gotten into my car, smoother and more confident, like she wasn't affected by the cold or the weather anymore. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, trying to calm down and figure out what had just happened. Then drove the rest of the way to the hospital in a state of complete confusion and fear. When I got to work, I tried to forget about the hitchhiker and focus on my patients. But I couldn't stop thinking about her predictions and the things she'd said about someone coming in that I'd recognize. Around 7 in the morning, the paramedics brought in a man who'd been in a single car accident. And when I saw his face, I nearly collapsed. It was my ex-wife's new boyfriend, someone I'd met twice at awkward social gatherings, someone I'd actively disliked because he'd replaced me in Rebecca's life. He was unconscious and bleeding internally, and despite everything we did, despite all the medical knowledge and equipment and expertise we threw at his case, he died an hour later. I never saw that hitchhiker again, and I never figured out how she knew the things she knew or how she could have predicted what would happen that night. But I know she was real, and I know she was dangerous. And I know that picking her up was the biggest mistake I'd ever made. I stopped trying to help strangers after that, stopped being the kind of person who pulls over for hitchhikers or gives money to homeless people or goes out of his way to make other people's lives easier. Maybe that makes me a worse person. But it also makes me a safer person. And after what happened that night, I decided that my safety was more important than my compassion. My name is Zaire, and I'm 54 years old, recently retired from 30 years of teaching high school mathematics in Portland, Oregon. I've always considered myself a logical person, someone who believes in facts and evidence and reasonable explanations for everything. Which is probably why what happened to me 6 months ago has been so difficult to process and accept. I'm not good with technology, never have been. But my daughter insisted I get one of those GPS navigation systems for my car when I told her I was planning to drive cross-country to visit my grandchildren in North Carolina. She said it would make the trip safer and easier, that I wouldn't have to worry about getting lost or reading paper maps while driving, and that the GPS would find the fastest routes and warn me about traffic problems ahead of time. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months, ever since my retirement party in June. After 3 decades of dealing with teenagers who thought algebra was a form of torture and parents who blamed me for their children's lack of motivation, I was ready for some peace and quiet on the open road. My son Michael lived in Asheville with his wife and 2 kids, and I hadn't seen them since Christmas because flights were so expensive and driving seemed like too much of a hassle when I was still working full-time. But now I had all the time in the world, and I figured a leisurely drive across the country would be exactly what I needed to decompress from all those years in the classroom. The GPS seemed simple enough when my daughter explained it to me. You just type in your destination, and it calculates the best route and gives you turn-by-turn directions in a pleasant female voice that tells you exactly when to turn and which lanes to use. It even shows you how much time the trip will take and warns you about construction zones or accidents that might slow you down. I tested it a few times driving around Portland, and it worked perfectly. So I felt confident about using it for the longer journey to North Carolina. I left Portland on a Tuesday morning in September, planning to take my time and drive about 6 hours a day, stopping whenever I wanted to see interesting sights or just stretch my legs. The first day went exactly as planned. The GPS guided me through Oregon and into Idaho without any problems, and I spent the night in a comfortable motel in Boise. Feeling proud of myself for managing the technology and making good progress toward my destination. The second day was equally smooth, taking me across Idaho and into Wyoming, where I stopped for the night in a small town called Rawlins that the GPS had recommended as a good halfway point. But on the third day, somewhere in the remote areas of Wyoming, things started to go wrong in ways I still can't fully explain. I was driving through some of the most desolate landscape I'd ever seen, just endless stretches of brown hills and scrub brush, with no signs of civilization for miles in any direction. The GPS had been working normally all morning, giving me clear directions and keeping me on Interstate 80 toward Nebraska. But around noon, it suddenly announced that it was recalculating the route and that I should take the next exit to stay on the fastest path to my destination. I was surprised because I couldn't see any reason why leaving the interstate would be faster than staying on it. But I figured the GPS probably knew about road construction or traffic problems that I couldn't see yet, so I followed its instructions and took the exit. The road it directed me onto was a narrow 2-lane highway that didn't look like it got much traffic. But the GPS seemed confident this was the right way, so I kept following its directions as it led me deeper and deeper into the Wyoming wilderness. After about an hour of driving on increasingly remote roads, I started to feel uncomfortable about the route the GPS had chosen. I hadn't seen another car in over 30 minutes, and the roads were getting narrower and more primitive, like they were designed for local ranch traffic rather than long-distance travelers. The GPS kept telling me to turn onto smaller and smaller roads, some of which weren't even paved, just gravel tracks that wound through hills and valleys that looked like they'd never been developed or inhabited by anyone. I tried to turn the GPS off and turn around to get back to the interstate, but every time I stopped and tried to change the destination or cancel the route, the device would restart itself and continue giving me directions to take the next turn. It was like it had developed a mind of its own and was determined to take me wherever it wanted me to go, regardless of what I wanted to do. I'd never experienced anything like it before, and my limited understanding of technology wasn't enough to figure out how to override whatever was controlling the navigation system. By mid-afternoon, I was completely lost in terrain that looked more like the surface of Mars than anything I'd expected to find in Wyoming. The GPS had led me into a maze of dirt roads and cattle paths that seemed to wind randomly through a landscape of red rocks and deep canyons that I was pretty sure weren't on any official maps. I hadn't seen a single sign of human habitation for hours, no houses or barns or even fence posts. Just endless miles of wilderness that seemed to stretch to the horizon in every direction. That's when I started encountering the people, if you could call them people. They appeared at first as distant figures standing on hilltops or beside the road, always just far enough away that I couldn't see them clearly, but close enough that I knew they were watching me. At first, I thought they might be ranchers or hunters, locals who were curious about a stranger driving through their remote area. But as I saw more and more of them, their behavior started to seem increasingly strange and threatening. They never waved or acknowledged me in any normal way. They just stood perfectly still and watched my car pass, turning their heads to follow my movement like security cameras tracking an intruder. Some of them appeared to be holding tools or weapons, though I couldn't make out exactly what they were carrying from a distance. Others seemed to be communicating with each other in ways I couldn't understand, making gestures or signals that suggested they were coordinating their activities and reporting on my location and direction of travel. The GPS continued to guide me deeper into this nightmare landscape, directing me to turn onto roads that barely deserved the name. Just tire tracks through sand and rocks that threatened to damage my car with every mile. I was starting to panic about running out of gas or getting stuck somewhere so remote that no one would ever find me. But every time I tried to turn around or find a different route, the GPS would recalculate and direct me back onto the same impossible path. As the sun began to set, the situation became even more terrifying. The figures I'd been seeing all day started to move closer to the road, some of them following my car on foot at a pace that should have been impossible for humans to maintain. I could see them in my rearview mirror, dark shapes jogging along behind me through the gathering dusk, never falling behind, no matter how fast I drove on the rough terrain. Others appeared ahead of me, standing directly in the road as if they were trying to force me to stop. but whenever I got close enough to see them clearly, they would step aside and disappear into the rocks and brush. The GPS finally led me to what looked like a small settlement, a cluster of buildings that appeared suddenly around a bend in the road, like something out of a fever dream. It wasn't marked on any signs, and it didn't look like any normal town I'd ever seen. The buildings were old and weathered, constructed from materials that seemed to have been scavenged from different sources and assembled without any coherent plan or architectural style. There were no power lines or telephone poles, no paved streets or sidewalks, no cars or trucks or any other signs of modern civilization. The GPS announced that I had reached my destination, which was impossible because I was supposed to be going to North Carolina, not some abandoned settlement in the middle of Wyoming. I stopped the car and tried to figure out what was happening. But before I could decide what to do next, people started emerging from the buildings and gathering around my car. They moved slowly and deliberately, like they'd been waiting for me to arrive. And their faces were pale and gaunt in a way that suggested malnutrition or disease. They didn't speak or make any threatening gestures. They just surrounded my car and stared at me through the windows with expressions that I can only describe as hungry. Some of them reached out and touched the car's surface, running their fingers along the metal and glass like they were examining something they'd never seen before. Others seemed to be studying me specifically, looking at my clothes and my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I realized I needed to get out of there immediately, before whatever these people were planning could happen. I put the car in reverse and backed away from the crowd as carefully as I could, trying not to hit anyone but determined to escape whatever trap I'd driven into. The GPS immediately started recalculating, trying to guide me back toward the settlement. But I ignored its directions and drove in the opposite direction as fast as the rough roads would allow. It took me 6 hours to find my way back to Interstate 80, 6 hours of driving through darkness on roads that seemed to shift and change every time I thought I was making progress toward civilization. The GPS fought me the entire way, constantly trying to redirect me back toward that horrible settlement, until I finally threw it out the window in frustration and navigated by the stars and my own sense of direction. When I finally reached the interstate, I drove straight through the night to Denver, where I stopped at the first electronics store I could find and bought a paper atlas. I completed the rest of my trip to North Carolina using old-fashioned maps and written directions, and I never used a GPS navigation system again. My daughter thinks I'm being paranoid and stubborn, that I probably just made a mistake with the technology or encountered some kind of software glitch. But I know what I experienced, and I know that GPS was deliberately trying to lead me somewhere I was never supposed to go. My name is Corbin, and I'm 22 years old. Just finished my sophomore year at Oregon State University, studying business administration. I'm from a small town in eastern Oregon where nothing really bad ever happens. And I guess that made me more trusting and less cautious than I should have been when I went on my spring break road trip to California last March. I'd been planning this trip for months, saving up money from my part-time job at a local restaurant and mapping out all the places I wanted to visit along the coast. I was driving down by myself because most of my friends couldn't afford the trip or had other plans. But I was actually looking forward to having some time alone on the road, just me and my music and the open highway stretching out toward the Pacific Ocean. I'd been driving for about 8 hours straight when I started getting really tired somewhere around midnight on Interstate 5, just south of Redding, California. I don't normally drive at night for long distances because I tend to get drowsy. But I'd gotten a late start leaving campus, and I was eager to make up time so I could spend more days actually enjoying the beach instead of just sitting in my car. The coffee I'd bought in Oregon had worn off hours ago. And I was starting to do that thing where your eyelids get heavy and you catch yourself drifting toward the shoulder which I knew was dangerous and stupid, especially when I was driving alone with no one to take over if I got too tired to continue safely. That's when I saw the signs for a 24-hour truck stop coming up at the next exit, one of those big travel centers that cater to long-haul truckers, but also serve regular travelers who need gas, food, or just a place to rest for a few hours. I figured I'd stop for another cup of coffee and maybe walk around the parking lot for 10 minutes to wake myself up before continuing south toward Los Angeles. The place looked pretty standard from the outside. Bright lights, plenty of parking spaces for cars and trucks, and a convenience store that appeared to be busy even at this late hour, which made me feel like it was a safe and normal place to stop. I parked near the convenience store and went inside to buy coffee and maybe some snacks to keep my energy up for the rest of the drive. The store was bigger than I expected, with several aisles of typical road trip supplies like energy drinks, chips, candy, and those pre-made sandwiches that taste like cardboard but fill you up when you're hungry and don't have many options. There were a few other customers wandering around, mostly truck drivers in flannel shirts and baseball caps, plus a couple of other travelers who looked like they were on long-distance trips similar to mine. The clerk behind the counter was a woman in her 40s with bleached blonde hair and a friendly smile, who asked me if I was having a good trip and where I was headed. I told her I was driving to California for spring break, and she said that sounded like fun and that she wished she could take a vacation like that. She seemed genuinely interested in my travel plans, asking about which beaches I was planning to visit and whether this was my first time driving to California by myself. Which I thought was nice, because most convenience store clerks just want to complete the transaction and move on to the next customer. I bought a large coffee and a bag of chips, and as I was paying, the clerk mentioned that they had really comfortable seating areas in the back of the store, where travelers could sit and rest for a while if they needed to take a break from driving. She said a lot of people use those areas to catch a quick nap or just relax before getting back on the road, and that it was much safer than trying to sleep in your car in the parking lot where you might get bothered by other travelers or have your belongings stolen. I thanked her for the suggestion and said I might check it out after I finished my coffee and stretched my legs a bit outside. I walked around the parking lot for a few minutes, drinking my coffee and trying to wake myself up. But I was still feeling pretty drowsy. So I decided to take the clerk's advice and check out the seating area she'd mentioned. I went back inside and found the area she was talking about, a section toward the rear of the store with several comfortable-looking chairs and small tables where people could sit and eat or just rest. There were already a few people sitting back there, including a couple of truck drivers eating sandwiches and an older man reading a newspaper. So it seemed like a legitimate and safe place to spend a few minutes recovering from the long drive. I sat down in one of the chairs and started sipping my coffee, checking my phone to see how much further I had to drive to reach my hotel in Los Angeles. That's when I started noticing that the other people in the seating area were paying more attention to me than seemed normal for strangers sharing a public space. The truck drivers kept glancing over at me between bites of their sandwiches, and the older man with the newspaper was looking at me over the top of the pages in a way that made me feel uncomfortable, like he was studying me rather than just casually observing his surroundings. I tried to ignore their attention and focus on my phone, but after a few minutes, I started feeling unusually drowsy, much more tired than I should have been after drinking a large cup of coffee that was supposed to wake me up. My eyelids were getting heavy in a way that felt different from normal tiredness, more like the way you feel when you're getting sick or when you've taken cold medicine that makes you sleepy. I thought maybe I was just more exhausted from the long drive than I'd realized, but something about the situation was starting to feel wrong in a way I couldn't quite identify. The clerk who'd been so friendly when I bought my coffee came back to the seating area and asked how I was doing, whether the coffee was helping me feel more alert. When I told her I was actually feeling more tired than before, she laughed and said that sometimes happens when your body finally relaxes after being tense from driving for so many hours. She suggested I might want to lie down in one of the sleeping areas they had available for travelers, small rooms in the back of the building where people could rent a bed for a few hours if they needed to rest before continuing their journey. I'd never heard of truck stops having sleeping rooms like that, but she seemed very knowledgeable about the facilities and offered to show me where they were located. My thinking was getting fuzzy, and the idea of lying down for an hour or two was starting to seem very appealing, even though part of my brain was trying to tell me that something wasn't right about the situation. The clerk led me toward the back of the building, past the restrooms, and through a door I hadn't noticed before, into a corridor lined with small rooms that looked more like motel rooms than anything I'd expect to find in a truck stop. She opened the door to one of the rooms and showed me inside, explaining that there was no charge for using the facilities as long as I'd made a purchase in the store, which I had. The room had a single bed, a small table, and no windows, which struck me as odd, but not necessarily suspicious, since these were supposed to be rooms for napping rather than overnight stays. She said I could rest as long as I needed to, and that someone would check on me in a few hours to make sure I was doing okay. Then she left and closed the door behind her. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to fight off the overwhelming drowsiness that was making it difficult to think clearly. Something was definitely wrong with how tired I felt, especially since I'd just consumed a large amount of caffeine that should have had the opposite effect. I tried to stand up and leave the room, but my legs felt unsteady and my coordination was off in a way that reminded me of the few times in college when I'd had too much to drink, except I hadn't consumed any alcohol that evening. That's when I heard voices in the corridor outside the room, multiple people talking in low tones about something they clearly didn't want to be overheard discussing. I couldn't make out most of what they were saying, but I caught enough words to understand that they were talking about me, using phrases like the college kid and ready for transport. That made my blood run cold despite the fog in my brain. I realized I needed to get out of there immediately, before whatever they had planned could happen. But I was having trouble coordinating my movements and thinking clearly enough to form a plan. I forced myself to stand up and tried the door, but it was locked from the outside, which confirmed my worst fears about what was happening. I was trapped in a windowless room, drugged and helpless, with people outside who clearly had bad intentions toward me. I started pounding on the door and yelling for help, but my voice sounded weak and slurred even to my own ears, and I could hear the people in the corridor laughing at my attempts to escape. The drowsiness was getting worse by the minute, and I knew that if I gave in to it and lost consciousness, I might never wake up again. Or if I did, it would be in a situation much worse than being locked in a truck stop room. I fought against the effects of whatever they'd put in my coffee, slapping myself in the face and doing jumping jacks to keep my blood flowing and my mind as alert as possible. I searched the room for anything I could use as a weapon or tool to help me escape, but there was nothing except the bed and the small table. That's when I remembered my phone and realized I might be able to call for help. Even though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate the touch screen, I managed to dial 911, but when the operator answered, my speech was so slurred and confused that I had trouble explaining where I was or what was happening. I tried to give them the name of the truck stop and the exit number, but I wasn't sure if they understood what I was telling them, or if they thought I was just a drunk college kid making a prank call. I could hear more activity in the corridor outside my room, people moving around and preparing for something that I was pretty sure involved me leaving that place against my will. The drug they'd given me was making it increasingly difficult to stay conscious and think rationally. But I knew I had to do something drastic before I lost the ability to help myself. I picked up the small table and used it to break the lock on the door, making enough noise that I hoped it would attract attention from legitimate travelers or employees who weren't part of whatever scheme was happening. The door burst open, and I stumbled out into the corridor, nearly colliding with the friendly clerk who was no longer looking friendly at all. She tried to grab my arm and pull me back into the room, saying I needed to rest and that everything would be fine. But I pushed past her and ran toward what I hoped was the exit. My coordination was still terrible, and I bounced off walls and stumbled over my own feet. But I managed to make it back to the main part of the store where there were other customers who could witness whatever was about to happen. I made it to my car and drove away from that place as fast as I could, even though I probably shouldn't have been driving in my condition. I stopped at a well-lit gas station about 20 miles down the road and called the police again, this time managing to give them a clearer report of what had happened. When they investigated the truck stop the next day, they found that it was a legitimate business, and the employees denied any knowledge of drugging customers or having sleeping rooms in the back of the building. I never found out exactly what they were planning to do to me or how many other travelers had been targeted at that place. But I know I came very close to disappearing that night. And I know that if I hadn't fought off the effects of whatever drug they gave me, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I learned that human trafficking is much more common than most people realize, and that criminals who engage in it are very good at appearing normal and trustworthy while they're setting up their victims for abduction. My name is Asa, and I'm 37 years old. Work as a freelance graphic designer from my home office in Sacramento, California. I've always been the type of person who believes there's a logical explanation for everything. Someone who approaches problems methodically and doesn't get rattled easily by unexpected situations. But what happened to me 8 months ago on a routine drive to visit a client in Reno challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. And I still can't come up with a rational explanation that makes sense of what I experienced that day. I've replayed it in my mind thousands of times, looked at maps, researched the area extensively, and even driven the same route multiple times trying to recreate the circumstances. But I've never been able to find any trace of what I encountered that October afternoon. I was driving from Sacramento to Reno on Highway 80, a route I'd taken probably 40 times over the past 5 years for various client meetings and business trips. It's a straightforward drive that usually takes about 2.5 hours, mostly through Sierra Nevada foothills, and then up into the mountains before descending into Nevada. I know that road well enough that I could probably drive it with my eyes closed. Which is why what happened was so disorienting and impossible to explain. I'd left my house around noon on a Tuesday, planning to arrive in Reno by 3 o'clock for a 4 o'clock meeting with a casino that wanted me to redesign their promotional materials for the holiday season. The weather was perfect for driving, clear blue skies and comfortable temperatures in the mid-70s. Exactly the kind of day that makes you appreciate living in California. I had my favorite playlist running, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and I was actually looking forward to the drive because I'd been stuck in my office for weeks working on a complicated project and needed some time to clear my head and think about other things. The first hour of the trip was completely normal, just rolling through the familiar landscape of suburban Sacramento, giving way to agricultural areas, and then the beginning of the foothills. But somewhere around Auburn, I started noticing that the landscape looked different from what I remembered. The hills seemed greener and more lush, like it was late spring instead of mid-fall. And there were flowering trees along the roadside that shouldn't have been blooming in October. I thought maybe I just hadn't been paying attention during my previous trips. Or maybe the drought conditions from earlier in the year had ended and everything was growing more vigorously than usual. I didn't think much of it at first, just made a mental note that the scenery was prettier than I remembered. As I continued climbing into the mountains, the changes became more obvious and harder to ignore. The trees were different varieties from what I was used to seeing along that route. More deciduous hardwoods and fewer of the pine and fir trees that typically dominate the Sierra Nevada forests. The road itself seemed wider and smoother than I remembered, with newer-looking guardrails and signage that appeared to have been recently installed. Even the quality of the pavement was better, like the entire highway had been completely rebuilt since my last trip just 2 months earlier. I started paying more attention to the mile markers and exit signs, trying to confirm that I was still on the right route. But the exits were for towns I'd never heard of, despite driving this road dozens of times. Instead of familiar names like Colfax and Truckee, I was seeing signs for places called Millbrook and Cedar Falls, communities that weren't on any maps I'd ever seen of the area. My GPS was still showing that I was on Highway 80 heading toward Reno, but the estimated arrival time had changed from the usual 2.5 hours to over 4 hours. Like the system had suddenly decided the distance was much greater than it actually was. The traffic was different too, much lighter than I'd ever experienced on that route during a weekday afternoon. Highway 80 is usually pretty busy with commuters and truckers, but I was seeing maybe one car every 10 minutes, and most of them were older models from the 1950s and 1960s that looked like they'd been perfectly preserved or restored to showroom condition. The few drivers I could see clearly were dressed in clothing styles that seemed outdated, men in suits and fedoras, women in dresses and headscarves, like they were heading to a vintage car show or historical reenactment event. Around what should have been the halfway point of my trip, I crested a hill and saw something that made me pull over to the side of the road in complete confusion. Spread out in the valley below me was a town that definitely hadn't been there during my previous trips. A substantial community with what looked like several thousand residents, complete with downtown commercial districts, residential neighborhoods, and industrial areas on the outskirts. According to my understanding of the geography, this area should have been mostly wilderness, with maybe a few scattered houses and a gas station or two. The architecture of the town was unlike anything I'd seen in modern California, with Art Deco buildings and wide boulevards that looked like they'd been designed in the 1930s or 1940s. Everything appeared to be in perfect condition, like the entire community had been built recently, but designed to look like it was from an earlier era. There were people walking around the streets, cars parked along the curbs, and smoke rising from chimneys, clear signs that this was an active, functioning town rather than some kind of abandoned historical site or movie set. I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I'd driven this exact route many times, and I was certain there had never been a town of this size in this location. I checked my GPS again, and it was still insisting I was on Highway 80, but now it was showing that Reno was still over 3 hours away, which was impossible given how far I'd already traveled. I tried calling my client to let them know I might be late for our meeting, but my phone had no signal despite being in an area where I'd always had good coverage in the past. I decided to drive down into the town to see if I could figure out where I was, and maybe get directions back to the correct route to Reno. The main street was lined with businesses that looked like they belonged in a different decade. A five-and-dime store, a soda fountain, a movie theater showing films I'd never heard of, and a gas station with old-fashioned pumps that looked like antiques. The few people I saw on the sidewalks were dressed in the same vintage clothing I'd noticed in the cars, and they moved with a leisurely pace that suggested they had all the time in the world. I parked in front of what appeared to be a diner and went inside to ask for directions. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from the 1950s, with red vinyl booths, a long counter with chrome stools, and a jukebox playing music I recognized as being from that era. The waitress behind the counter was a woman in her 40s wearing a uniform that looked like something from an old television show, complete with a small white cap and an apron with the diner's name embroidered on it. When I asked her about getting to Reno, She looked confused and said she'd never heard of any place by that name. I tried to explain that it was a major city in Nevada, just a few hours east of where we were, but she insisted that we were in California and that the nearest city of any significant size was San Francisco, which was several hours to the west. I asked her what town we were in, and she said it was called Millbrook, which matched one of the road signs I'd seen earlier, but didn't correspond to any place I could find on any maps. I tried to show her my GPS to prove that Reno existed and that I was supposed to be heading there. But my phone was completely dead, despite having been fully charged when I left Sacramento. She offered to let me use the diner's phone to call someone. But when I tried to dial numbers I knew by heart, I kept getting recordings saying that the numbers were not in service or had been disconnected. Even directory assistants couldn't find listings for people and businesses I knew existed. Like they'd been completely erased from all records. I spent about an hour in that diner, trying to figure out what was happening and how to get back to the world I knew. The other customers seemed friendly enough, but they all talked about current events and cultural references that sounded like they were from the 1950s, discussing politicians who'd been dead for decades and movies that had been made before I was born. When I mentioned modern technology or recent historical events, they looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language or making up stories about things that had never happened. Eventually, I decided I needed to get out of there and try to find my way back to the highway, even though I wasn't sure which direction to go or how to get back to the route I'd been following. I thanked the waitress for her help, left money for the coffee I'd ordered, and walked back to my car. But when I got outside, I realized I had a bigger problem than just being lost. My car looked different, older somehow, like it had aged several decades in the hour I'd been inside the diner. The paint was faded, the chrome was tarnished, and the interior had developed a musty smell like it had been sitting unused for years. I drove out of Millbrook as quickly as I could, following road signs that pointed toward Sacramento, hoping I could retrace my route and figure out where I'd made a wrong turn. But as I climbed back up into the hills, the landscape began to change again, gradually returning to the familiar pine forests and granite outcroppings I associated with the Sierra Nevada mountains. The road narrowed, and the pavement became rougher, more like the Highway 80 I remembered. And when I crested the same hill where I'd first seen the mysterious town, the valley below was empty wilderness, exactly as it should have been. My GPS came back to life and showed that I was indeed on Highway 80, about 2 hours from Reno, which meant I'd somehow lost an entire day during my detour through Millbrook. It was getting dark, and I'd missed my client meeting by several hours. But I was more concerned about understanding what had happened to me than I was about business obligations. I drove straight through to Reno and spent the night in a hotel, trying to research the town I'd visited. But I couldn't find any historical records of a place called Millbrook ever existing in that area. I've driven that same route many times since then, always watching for any sign of the town or the road that led to it. But I've never seen anything except the familiar wilderness and scattered rest stops that have always been there. My client rescheduled our meeting for the following week, and I never told them or anyone else about what really happened during that lost day, because I knew they'd think I was having some kind of mental breakdown or making up stories for attention. But I know what I experienced was real, and I know that somewhere out there, probably just a few miles off the highway I travel regularly, there's a town that exists in a different time, populated by people who have no idea that the world has moved on without them. My name is Yusuf, and I'm 43 years old. Work as a real estate agent in Denver, Colorado, specializing in mountain properties and vacation homes. I've been driving through the Colorado Rockies for over 20 years, both for business and pleasure. And I thought I knew every pass, every road, and every potential hazard these mountains could throw at drivers. I've dealt with sudden blizzards, rock slides, mechanical failures, and wildlife encounters. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened to me last February on Highway 285. Heading toward a property showing near Fairplay. I consider myself a pretty independent person. Someone who's comfortable in remote areas and capable of handling difficult situations. But that night tested every survival instinct I had and left me with a completely different understanding of how dangerous the mountains can really be. I was driving up to show a luxury cabin to some clients from Texas who were looking for a winter retreat, something secluded and private where they could escape the city for ski weekends and holiday gatherings. The property was about 2 hours southwest of Denver, up in the high country, where the elevation reaches over 10,000 feet and the weather can change from beautiful to deadly in a matter of minutes. I'd made this drive hundreds of times before, but this particular trip was scheduled for late afternoon in February, which meant I'd be driving back down in the dark, something I usually tried to avoid during winter months because of the increased risk of ice and snow. The weather forecast had called for partly cloudy skies with temperatures in the 20s, nothing unusual for that time of year and elevation, so I wasn't particularly concerned about the drive. I had a reliable 4-wheel drive SUV with good tires, emergency supplies in the back, and enough experience with mountain driving to handle most situations that might come up. The property showing went well, and the client seemed genuinely interested in making an offer. So I was in a good mood as I started the drive back to Denver around 6:30 in the evening, just as the sun was setting behind the peaks to the west. For the first hour, everything was normal. The roads were clear, traffic was light, and the temperature was holding steady in the low 20s, cold but not dangerously so. I was making good time and expected to be back in Denver by 9 o'clock. Maybe stop for dinner somewhere along the way, if I found a place that looked appealing. I was listening to a podcast about real estate market trends and thinking about how to structure the offer for my clients when I noticed the first snowflakes starting to fall. Just a light dusting that wasn't accumulating on the road surface. But within 20 minutes, the light snow had turned into a heavy snowfall. The kind where the flakes are so thick and fast that your visibility drops to maybe 50 feet in front of your headlights. The temperature had also dropped significantly, from the low 20s down to around 10 degrees, and the snow was starting to stick to the pavement, creating slick conditions that made driving much more dangerous. I slowed down to about 30 miles per hour and turned on my hazard lights, trying to maintain a safe distance from the few other vehicles I could see ahead of me. That's when the wind started picking up, turning the heavy snowfall into a blizzard that reduced visibility to almost zero. I could barely see the road in front of me, even with my headlights on high beam, and the wind was strong enough to rock my SUV and make steering more difficult. I knew I needed to find shelter somewhere and wait out the storm rather than trying to continue driving in these conditions. But I was in a section of highway that didn't have any towns or services for miles in either direction. I was creeping along at maybe 15 miles per hour, looking for any kind of building or shelter where I could pull off and wait, when I saw lights ahead through the blizzard. As I got closer, I could see it was some kind of roadside establishment, maybe a restaurant or gas station, with several vehicles parked outside and warm yellow light streaming from the windows. I was incredibly relieved to find somewhere to get out of the storm, and I pulled into the parking lot next to what looked like a pickup truck and a couple of cars that were already covered with several inches of snow. The building turned out to be a small roadside diner, the kind of place that caters to truckers and travelers passing through the mountains. It looked like it had been there for decades, with weathered wood siding and a neon sign that flickered in the wind. But the important thing was that it was open and warm and safe from the blizzard raging outside. I parked as close to the entrance as I could and ran through the snow to get inside, grateful to be out of the wind and cold. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from a mountain diner, with vinyl booths, a long counter with stools, and the smell of coffee and fried food that made me realize I was hungry. There were maybe half a dozen other customers inside, all of them looking like locals rather than travelers. Men in work clothes and heavy jackets who were drinking coffee and talking in low voices about the storm and how long it might last. The waitress was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and a friendly smile, who told me I'd made a smart decision to get off the road when I did. I ordered coffee and a sandwich and settled into a booth near the window, where I could keep an eye on my car and watch the storm. The other customers seemed welcoming enough, nodding when I made eye contact and including me in their conversations about the weather and road conditions. One of them, an older man wearing a rancher's coat, told me the storm was supposed to blow through by morning and that I'd probably be able to get back on the road safely if I waited until sunrise. Another customer, a younger guy who said he worked for the highway department, warned me that even after the snow stopped, the roads would be icy and dangerous for several hours until the plows could get through. I was content to wait out the storm in the warm diner, drinking coffee and chatting with the locals about mountain living and winter survival, when the conversation took a turn that made me uncomfortable. The rancher started talking about how isolated this area was, how far it was from the nearest town or help if someone got into trouble, and how easy it would be for people to just disappear up here without anyone ever knowing what happened to them. The highway worker agreed, saying that every winter they found cars that had gone off the road with people inside who'd frozen to death before anyone could find them. At first, I thought they were just trying to emphasize how dangerous the mountains could be in winter, maybe warn me to be extra careful when I continued my journey. But as the conversation continued, their comments became more specific and more threatening, with references to travelers who'd stopped at the diner and never made it to their destinations, and suggestions that some disappearances weren't as accidental as they appeared to the authorities. The way they were looking at me had changed too, less friendly and more predatory, like they were sizing me up for something I didn't want to think about. I tried to change the subject and talk about neutral topics like the weather and local businesses. But they kept steering the conversation back to stories about people who'd gone missing in the area and how the isolation made it impossible for law enforcement to investigate properly. The waitress, who'd seemed so friendly when I arrived, was now avoiding eye contact and seemed nervous about something, like she knew what was being discussed but didn't want to be part of it. I started to wonder if she was a willing participant in whatever was happening or if she was as trapped as I was beginning to feel. That's when I noticed that the storm outside had gotten worse, not better, and that the other customers were making no moves to leave, despite having been there when I arrived over an hour earlier. It was like they were waiting for something specific to happen, or for the conditions outside to reach a point where escape would be impossible. I also realized that I hadn't seen any other vehicles arrive or leave since I'd been there, which was strange for a business that was supposed to serve highway travelers. I excused myself to go to the restroom, but really, I wanted to get closer to the back of the building and see if there were other exits I could use if I needed to leave quickly. What I found in the hallway behind the dining room made my blood run cold. There were personal belongings scattered on shelves and hooks like some kind of trophy collection. Wallets, purses, jewelry, car keys, and driver's licenses from people with addresses all over the country. Some of the licenses were recent, but others were years old, suggesting this had been going on for a long time. I also found a door that led to what looked like a storage room. But when I peered inside, I saw sleeping bags and camping equipment that didn't belong to the diner, along with clothes and suitcases that clearly belonged to travelers who were no longer around to claim them. There was also a large freezer that I didn't want to investigate too closely. but the smell coming from it made me suspect it wasn't just storing food for the restaurant. I realized I needed to get out of there immediately, before whatever they had planned for me could happen. I went back to my booth and told the others I needed to check on my car and make sure the snow wasn't piling up too high around it. The rancher offered to come outside with me to help clear the snow, but I politely declined and said I could handle it myself. I put on my jacket and walked toward the door, trying to act casual while mentally preparing to run to my car and drive away as fast as possible. But when I got outside, I discovered that someone had been busy while I was inside the diner. My SUV was completely buried under snow that had obviously been shoveled onto it deliberately, far more snow than could have accumulated naturally in the time I'd been inside. The tires had also been chained to prevent me from driving away. And when I looked under the hood, I could see that someone had disconnected the battery cables, ensuring that the engine wouldn't start even if I could dig it out. I was trapped in a blizzard with people who clearly intended to harm me. Miles from any help, with no way to escape except on foot through conditions that would probably kill me before I could reach safety. I could see faces watching me from the diner windows, and I knew they were waiting to see what I would do next. Running into the storm would mean almost certain death from exposure. But staying would definitely mean whatever fate had befallen all those other travelers whose belongings I'd seen in the back room. I made the decision to try to survive in the wilderness rather than trust my fate to the people in the diner. I had emergency supplies in my car, including a sleeping bag, some food, and chemical hand warmers. And I knew there were abandoned mining cabins scattered throughout these mountains that might provide better shelter than being out in the open. I quietly gathered what supplies I could carry and slipped away from the diner into the blizzard, hoping to find shelter before hypothermia could kill me. I spent the most terrifying night of my life, huddled in a partially collapsed cabin about 2 miles from the diner, burning pieces of broken furniture to stay warm and waiting for the storm to pass. When morning came, the sky was clear and I was able to hike down to the highway, where I flagged down a passing snowplow. The driver took me to the nearest town where I called the police and reported what I'd found at the diner. When the authorities investigated the location I described, they found nothing but an abandoned building that had been closed for years, with no signs of recent activity or evidence of the people I'd encountered. The official explanation was that I'd suffered from hypothermia and hallucinated the entire experience. But I know what I saw and what I experienced. I still drive through the mountains for business, but I'm much more careful about where I stop, and I never travel alone during winter storms. Some places in these mountains are dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with weather or wildlife. And sometimes the most deadly predators are the ones that walk on 2 legs and know how to use isolation and harsh conditions to their advantage. My name is Eric, and I'm 31 years old. Work construction for a company that builds commercial buildings around Nevada and Eastern California. I've been doing this kind of work for about 10 years now, ever since I got out of the Army. And I'm used to being in rough situations and handling myself when things go wrong. Construction sites can be dangerous places with all kinds of hazards, and military training taught me to stay calm under pressure and think my way through problems methodically. But what happened to me 4 months ago on Highway 50, driving to a job site near Ely, Nevada, was unlike anything I'd encountered in civilian life or during my deployment overseas. And it still makes me question my judgment about trusting strangers who offer help. I'd gotten a call on Friday afternoon from my foreman saying there was an emergency at one of our projects, some kind of structural problem that needed immediate attention over the weekend, and that I needed to drive out there Saturday morning to assess the situation and figure out what materials we'd need to fix it. Highway 50 is one of those lonely stretches of road that cuts through the middle of Nevada, mostly desert and small towns separated by miles of empty landscape. but I'd driven it before for work and knew what to expect. I loaded my truck with basic tools and headed out around 7 in the evening, planning to drive through the night and arrive at the job site early Saturday morning. The first few hours went fine. Just the usual desert scenery and light traffic, mostly long-haul truckers and a few other travelers heading east or west across the state. I had my radio playing country music and a thermos of coffee to keep me alert, and I was making good time despite having to maintain reasonable speeds on the winding sections through the mountains. My truck was running well. A 5-year-old Ford that I'd bought used but had been completely reliable for both work and personal use. So I wasn't expecting any mechanical problems during the trip. But around 11:30 at night, somewhere between Fallon and Austin in one of the most remote sections of the highway, my engine started making a grinding noise that I recognized as a bearing problem, something serious that would require immediate attention to prevent complete engine failure. The noise got worse quickly, and within a few minutes, the truck was losing power and overheating, forcing me to pull over on the shoulder before the engine seized completely. I was in the middle of nowhere, no cell phone signal, no lights visible in any direction, just desert stretching to the horizon under a sky full of stars. I got out and popped the hood, and even though I'm not a professional mechanic, I know enough about engines to recognize that this wasn't something I could fix on the side of the road with basic tools. The bearing noise was coming from deep inside the engine block, and there was coolant leaking from somewhere that I couldn't identify in the darkness. I was looking at either a very expensive tow to the nearest town or a complete engine replacement, neither of which was going to get me to the job site on time to deal with the emergency situation that had prompted this trip. I was standing there trying to figure out my options when I saw headlights approaching from the east, the first vehicle I'd seen in over an hour. As it got closer, I could see it was a pickup truck with some kind of equipment in the back, and it slowed down as it passed my disabled truck, then pulled over about 50 feet ahead of me. A man got out and walked back toward me, asking if I needed help with my vehicle. He appeared to be in his 40s, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap, and he introduced himself as Bill, said he was a mechanic who ran a shop in one of the small towns along the highway. Bill seemed knowledgeable about automotive problems, and after looking under my hood with a flashlight, he confirmed my diagnosis that the engine had thrown a bearing and would need major repairs to run again. He said his shop was about 20 miles ahead, and that he had the tools and parts to rebuild the engine if I was willing to pay for the work, which would probably take most of the weekend but would get me back on the road by Sunday or Monday. The alternative was calling for a tow truck, which might not arrive until the next day and would cost several $100s just to get the truck to a shop that might not have the right parts or expertise. Bill offered to tow my truck to his shop with the equipment he had in his pickup. And since I didn't have many other options and he seemed like a legitimate mechanic who understood the problem, I agreed to let him help me. He hooked up my truck to his tow rig, and I rode with him toward his shop, which he said was in a small town called Cedar Springs that I'd never heard of, but that he claimed was just off the highway. During the drive, he told me about his business and how he'd been working on cars and trucks in that area for over 15 years, serving travelers who had breakdowns on the lonely stretch of Highway 50. After about 30 minutes of driving on increasingly rough side roads, we arrived at what Bill said was his shop, a collection of buildings that looked more like an abandoned ranch than a commercial automotive facility. There were several old cars and trucks scattered around the property, some of them obviously non-functional and probably used for spare parts, along with various pieces of equipment and machinery that could have been either automotive tools or just random junk that had accumulated over the years. The main building was a large metal shop with overhead doors, and Bill pulled my truck inside and turned on some lights so we could get a better look at the engine problem. The interior of the shop was cluttered with tools, parts, and partially disassembled vehicles, but it looked like a legitimate repair facility where someone could actually work on cars and trucks. Bill seemed to know what he was doing as he examined my engine more closely, pointing out the specific components that had failed and explaining what would need to be replaced to get the truck running again. He quoted me a price that seemed reasonable for the amount of work involved and said he could start on the repairs first thing in the morning if I wanted to stay overnight at a motel in town and come back to check on the progress. That's when I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable about the situation. There was no town visible anywhere near the shop, just desert and hills in every direction, which contradicted Bill's earlier statements about Cedar Springs being a real community with businesses and services. There were also personal items scattered around the shop that obviously didn't belong to Bill, things like wallets, watches, and cell phones that looked like they'd been taken from travelers rather than left behind by customers. Some of the vehicles on the property had license plates from different states, and many of them showed signs of damage that suggested accidents or violence rather than normal mechanical failures. Bill noticed me looking around the shop and asked if I had any questions about the repair work or the timeline for getting my truck fixed, when I mentioned that I needed to call my boss and let him know I wouldn't make it to the job site on Saturday morning. Bill said there was no cell phone service in that area and that the nearest phone was back in town, which he could drive me to in the morning after we got started on the engine work. He suggested I sleep in the office area of the shop rather than trying to find accommodations elsewhere, since there weren't many options for travelers in such a remote location. The office turned out to be a small room behind the main shop area, with a couch, a desk, and some filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been used for business purposes in years. There were more personal items here that obviously belonged to other people, including driver's licenses and credit cards from travelers with addresses all over the western United States. There were also photographs and documents that suggested Bill had been targeting stranded motorists for much longer than he'd claimed, and that many of those people had never made it back to their destinations or contacted their families again. I realized I was in serious danger and needed to get out of there immediately. But I was miles from the highway with no transportation and no way to call for help. Bill was still in the main shop area, supposedly preparing to work on my truck. But I suspected he was actually planning something much worse than expensive repairs. I started looking for weapons or tools I could use to defend myself and for ways to escape from the building without being seen or heard by Bill. That's when I discovered the most disturbing evidence of what had been happening to other travelers who'd accepted Bill's help. In a storage room behind the office, I found personal belongings that had obviously been taken from victims, including suitcases full of clothes, jewelry, and family photographs. There were also documents like wills and insurance policies that suggested some of the victims had been wealthy or had valuable assets that Bill might have been trying to access. Most disturbing of all, there was a large chest freezer that I didn't want to investigate too closely. But the smell and the electrical cord running to it suggested it contained evidence of Bill's most serious crimes. I knew I had to escape before Bill finished whatever preparations he was making in the main shop area. I found a back door that led outside, and I slipped out into the desert, hoping to make it back to Highway 50 on foot and flag down a passing vehicle for help. The terrain was rough and unfamiliar, but I used my military training to navigate by the stars and move quietly across the landscape without attracting attention from Bill or anyone else who might be associated with his operation. It took me almost 4 hours to hike back to the highway, and by the time I reached the road, the sun was starting to rise and there was light traffic of early morning travelers. I flagged down a long-haul trucker who gave me a ride to the nearest town and helped me contact the police about what I'd discovered at Bill's shop. When the authorities investigated the location, they found evidence of multiple homicides and a criminal operation that had been targeting stranded motorists for several years. Bill was arrested and eventually convicted of several murders, though the exact number of victims was never determined because some of the evidence had been destroyed or disposed of in ways that made identification impossible. My truck was recovered from his shop, but I never had it repaired because I couldn't bring myself to drive a vehicle that had been part of such a horrible situation. I bought a new truck and continued working construction. But I'm much more careful about accepting help from strangers when I'm traveling in remote areas. And I always make sure someone knows my travel plans and expected arrival times. The desert highways of Nevada are beautiful and peaceful during the day, but they can hide dangers that most travelers never imagine. And sometimes the people who offer help are the ones you should fear the most. My name is Callan, and I'm 29 years old, recently married with 2 young children, Emma, who's 6, and Tyler, who's 4. I work as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Kansas City, and my wife Sarah teaches elementary school. So we don't get many opportunities for extended vacations during the school year. Last summer, we planned our first real family road trip, driving from Kansas City to visit my parents in Arkansas for my father's 70th birthday celebration. It was supposed to be a simple 2-day drive with an overnight stop somewhere in Missouri. Just a relaxing journey through familiar territory, with plenty of time to let the kids stretch their legs and see some interesting sights along the way. Sarah had been looking forward to this trip for months, planning activities to keep the children entertained during the drive, and researching family-friendly restaurants and attractions we could visit during our stops. We'd never taken the kids on a road trip longer than a few hours before, so we were excited to create some good memories and maybe start a tradition of annual family driving vacations to different destinations. I'm usually pretty careful about planning and preparation, especially when it involves my family's safety, so I had the car serviced before the trip, planned our route carefully, and packed emergency supplies in case we encountered any problems along the way. We left Kansas City on a Saturday morning around 9 o'clock, with the kids excited about the adventure and Sarah navigating with printed maps and directions she'd gotten from the internet. The first few hours went perfectly, with the children entertaining themselves with coloring books and travel games, while Sarah and I took turns driving and pointing out interesting landmarks and scenery. We stopped for lunch at a family restaurant that had a playground attached, giving Emma and Tyler a chance to burn off some energy while we ate and planned the rest of our route for the day. After lunch, we continued south through Missouri, following state highways that would take us through some small towns and scenic countryside rather than staying on the busy interstates. Sarah thought it would be more interesting for the kids to see rural America and maybe stop at some roadside attractions or local festivals if we found any along the way. The weather was perfect for driving, clear skies and temperatures in the low 80s, and we were making good time toward our planned overnight stop in a town called Greenwood that was supposed to be about halfway between Kansas City and my parents' house in Arkansas. But around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we took what we thought was the correct exit toward Greenwood and found ourselves driving through countryside that didn't match our maps or our expectations. The roads became narrower and more winding, taking us through heavily forested areas with no signs of the agricultural land and small communities we'd been expecting to see. Sarah checked and rechecked our directions, but the road signs we were seeing didn't match the route we'd planned, and we started to worry that we'd made a wrong turn somewhere and gotten lost. After about 30 minutes of driving on increasingly remote roads, we came to a small town that wasn't marked on any of our maps, but had a welcome sign identifying it as Millfield, population 847. The town looked like something from a much earlier era, with old-fashioned storefronts and houses that seemed to have been preserved exactly as they were built decades ago. There were people walking around the main street and children playing in yards, but something about the scene felt artificial or staged, like we were looking at a museum exhibit or movie set rather than a real community where people actually lived and worked. We decided to stop and ask for directions at what appeared to be the town's only gas station, a small building with old-style pumps that looked like they belonged in a 1950s photograph. The attendant was a friendly older man who seemed genuinely pleased to see visitors, especially a family with young children, and he gave us detailed directions to get back on track toward Greenwood. But when Emma asked if she could use the restroom, the attendant said the facilities were in the back of the building, and he offered to show her the way while Sarah and I finished getting directions and buying some snacks for the road. That's when things started to feel wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. The attendant was taking longer than seemed necessary to help Emma find the restroom, and when I walked to the back of the building to check on them, I found him offering her candy from a jar behind the counter and asking her questions about our family and our travel plans that seemed inappropriately personal for a stranger. When I told Emma it was time to go and thanked the attendant for his help, he seemed disappointed and said it was rare for families with children to visit Millfield, and that he hoped we'd consider staying longer or maybe even coming back for their annual summer festival. Back in the car, following the attendant's directions toward what he claimed was the route back to Greenwood, we found ourselves driving deeper into rural areas that seemed even more isolated than before. The roads were getting narrower and the forest was getting thicker. With no signs of the agricultural land or communities we should have been seeing if we were heading in the right direction, Sarah was getting anxious about our progress and worried that we'd be driving in the dark before we found our hotel, while the kids were starting to get restless and asking when we'd arrive at their grandparents' house. After another hour of following the attendant's directions, we arrived at another small town, this one called Cedar Valley, according to the welcome sign. But again, it wasn't marked on any of our maps, and it had the same artificially preserved appearance as Millfield. The people we saw seemed friendly and normal, but there was something about their behavior and their interactions with us that felt rehearsed or scripted, like they were playing roles in some kind of performance rather than just going about their daily business in a real community. We stopped at a small restaurant for dinner, hoping to get better directions and maybe find someone with more knowledge of the area who could help us get back on track toward Arkansas. The waitress was extremely attentive to Emma and Tyler, bringing them special treats and games to keep them entertained while we waited for our food. But her interest in the children seemed excessive and inappropriate. She kept asking them about their favorite activities and whether they were enjoying their vacation. And she made comments about how nice it would be if they could stay in Cedar Valley for a few days and experience all the fun things the town had to offer for visiting families. During dinner, other restaurant customers approached our table to welcome us to Cedar Valley and ask about our travel plans. But their questions felt more like interrogations than friendly conversation. They seemed particularly interested in whether anyone was expecting us at a specific time, whether we had firm reservations for the night, and whether anyone back home knew our exact route or itinerary. When I mentioned that we needed to get back on the road to reach our hotel in Greenwood, several people suggested that we consider staying in Cedar Valley instead, claiming that the accommodations there were much nicer and that it would be safer than driving unfamiliar roads in the dark. The restaurant manager, a woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Helen, offered to show us to the town's bed and breakfast, which she said was much more comfortable than any chain hotel and would give the children a chance to experience authentic small-town hospitality. She was very insistent that it would be dangerous for us to continue driving that evening, claiming that the roads to Greenwood were poorly marked and that many travelers got lost trying to navigate them after sunset. She also mentioned that the bed and breakfast served a special breakfast that children always loved, with local ingredients and recipes that had been passed down through generations. But as Helen was describing the bed and breakfast and trying to convince us to stay overnight in Cedar Valley, I noticed that Emma and Tyler were behaving strangely, more passive and compliant than usual, like they were becoming drowsy or disoriented, despite having been energetic and talkative earlier in the day. They weren't responding normally to questions or showing their usual enthusiasm for new experiences. And when Sarah tried to get them excited about continuing the drive to see their grandparents, they seemed confused about where we were going and why we needed to leave Cedar Valley. I realized that something had been put in their food or drinks to make them drowsy and compliant, and that the people in this town were trying to prevent us from leaving with our children. I told Sarah quietly that we needed to get out of there immediately, and I made excuses to Helen about needing to get something from our car. Instead of going to the car, I used my cell phone to try to call for help. But there was no signal anywhere in the town. Like all outside communication had been deliberately blocked or jammed. When we got back to our car, I discovered that someone had disabled it while we were in the restaurant. Either by removing essential parts or by damaging something under the hood that would prevent it from starting. The keys worked in the ignition, but the engine wouldn't turn over, leaving us stranded in a town where people were clearly planning to separate us from our children. I tried to act calm and normal while I figured out what to do, but Sarah could tell something was wrong, and the kids were getting more and more lethargic and unresponsive. Helen appeared beside our car and offered to help with whatever mechanical problem we were having, saying that the town had an excellent mechanic who could fix anything but that he wouldn't be available until the next morning. She again suggested that we stay at the bed and breakfast, and she offered to personally escort us there to make sure we were comfortable and that the children got a good night's sleep. She seemed confident that we wouldn't refuse her offer, like she knew we didn't have any other options and that we'd have to accept whatever she had planned for us. That's when I decided to take desperate action rather than allow our family to be separated or harmed by whatever these people were planning. I grabbed Emma and Tyler, told Sarah to run toward the edge of town, and started carrying the children away from the main street toward what looked like woods or farmland, where we might be able to hide until we could figure out how to get help. The kids were too drowsy to walk fast, but Sarah and I were able to carry them between us as we moved as quickly as possible away from the people who were following us. We made it to a wooded area about half a mile from the town center, where we hid until morning while trying to keep the children warm and comfortable. Emma and Tyler gradually became more alert as whatever drug they'd been given wore off. But they were confused about what had happened and why we were sleeping outside instead of in a hotel. When the sun came up, we were able to walk through the woods to a state highway, where we flagged down a passing truck driver who gave us a ride to the nearest real town and helped us contact the police. When the authorities investigated Cedar Valley, they found no evidence of the town or the people we'd encountered, just empty farmland and abandoned buildings that had been vacant for years. The official explanation was that we'd gotten lost and confused, possibly experiencing some kind of mass hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue. But I know what we experienced was real, and I know that our children came very close to disappearing forever in a place that shouldn't have existed. We never made it to Arkansas for my father's birthday, and we haven't taken any family road trips since then, because I can't risk putting Emma and Tyler in danger again by trusting that the places we encounter on unfamiliar roads are what they appear to be. My name is Kendrick, and I'm 63 years old, recently retired after 35 years of teaching high school history in Billings, Montana. I've always been the type of person who follows instructions carefully and trusts official authorities, probably because of my background in education, where rules and procedures are important for maintaining order and safety. I believe in being prepared and following proper protocols, which is why what happened to me 9 months ago on a cross-country drive to visit my daughter in Seattle was so disturbing and confusing. I still don't understand how official emergency broadcasts could be used to lead innocent people into dangerous situations. And I worry that other travelers might encounter similar deceptions without recognizing the warning signs. I was driving west on Interstate 90 through eastern Montana, heading toward Seattle to spend Thanksgiving with my daughter Rachel and her family. It was a trip I'd made several times since retiring, usually taking my time and stopping at historical sites and small towns along the way to break up the long drive. I'd left Billings around noon on a Tuesday, planning to reach Spokane by evening and then continue to Seattle the next morning. The weather was clear and cold, typical for November in Montana, and I was enjoying the familiar scenery of rolling hills and wide open spaces that I'd called home for most of my adult life. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I was listening to a classical music station on the radio when the programming was interrupted by what sounded like an official emergency broadcast. The automated voice announced that there was a severe weather emergency in the area, with dangerous ice storms moving through the region that were creating hazardous driving conditions on all major highways. The broadcast advised all travelers to seek immediate shelter and avoid driving until the storm system passed, which was expected to take several hours. I looked around at the clear skies and dry pavement, confused because there were no signs of any weather problems in my immediate area. But I've lived in Montana long enough to know that weather can change rapidly, especially in the mountains, and that conditions can be very different just a few miles away. I also knew that the emergency broadcast system was only used for serious situations that posed genuine threats to public safety. So I took the warning seriously and started looking for a place to stop and wait out the reported storm. The broadcast continued with specific instructions for travelers in my area, directing us to take the next exit and follow the signs to a designated emergency shelter that had been set up to accommodate stranded motorists. The voice provided detailed directions, including road numbers and landmark descriptions that seemed legitimate and well-informed about local geography. It emphasized that this was a mandatory evacuation of the highway system and that continuing to drive would put both myself and emergency responders at risk. I followed the instructions and took the next exit, which led to a smaller state highway that wound through hills and forests away from the main interstate. The road was well maintained and properly marked, and I could see other vehicles ahead of me that were apparently following the same emergency directions. I felt reassured that I wasn't the only traveler responding to the broadcast, and that the authorities were handling the situation in an organized and professional manner. After about 20 minutes of driving on increasingly remote roads, I began to question whether I was going in the right direction. The landscape was becoming more rugged and isolated, with fewer signs of civilization and no visible emergency services or shelter facilities. I was also starting to notice that the other vehicles I'd been following had gradually disappeared, leaving me alone on a narrow road that seemed to be leading deeper into wilderness rather than toward any kind of emergency shelter. I tried to turn around and head back toward the interstate, but the road had become too narrow for a safe U-turn, and there were no suitable places to pull off and reverse direction. I was committed to continuing forward until I could find a wider section of road or a connecting route that would take me back to the main highway. I was getting increasingly concerned about how far I'd traveled from I-90 and how long it would take me to get back on track toward Seattle. That's when I saw the buildings ahead, a cluster of structures that looked like they might be the emergency shelter mentioned in the broadcast. As I got closer, I could see that it was some kind of compound with several large buildings, a parking area, and people moving around the grounds. There were vehicles parked outside, including some that looked like they might belong to other travelers who'd responded to the same emergency broadcast. I felt relieved that I'd found the designated shelter and that I'd be able to wait safely for the reported storm to pass. But as I pulled into the parking area, I started noticing things that didn't seem right for an official emergency shelter. The buildings looked more like residential structures than public facilities, and the people I could see weren't wearing any kind of official uniforms or identification that would identify them as emergency personnel. There were also no signs or official markings that would indicate this was a government-operated shelter, and no emergency vehicles or communication equipment that I would expect to see at a legitimate disaster response facility. A man approached my car as I was sitting in the parking area, trying to decide whether this was actually the right place. He was dressed in civilian clothes and appeared to be in his 40s, with a friendly demeanor that seemed genuine, but somehow didn't feel entirely trustworthy. He welcomed me to the shelter and said he was glad I'd made it safely before the storm hit. But when I looked around, I still couldn't see any signs of approaching bad weather or any other indications of the emergency conditions described in the radio broadcast. The man explained that this was a private facility that worked with state authorities to provide emergency shelter for stranded travelers, and that I'd be able to stay there safely until the weather cleared and the highways reopened. He offered to show me to a sleeping area where I could rest and get something to eat while waiting for the all-clear signal from the authorities. He seemed knowledgeable about the emergency procedures and spoke confidently about the weather situation. But something about his manner made me uncomfortable. I asked to see some official documentation or authorization that would confirm this was a legitimate emergency shelter. But the man said those kinds of paperwork details weren't necessary during crisis situations and that the important thing was getting people to safety as quickly as possible. He became more insistent that I come inside and get settled, saying that the storm would arrive soon and that it wouldn't be safe for me to be outside when it hit. That's when I started to suspect that something was seriously wrong with the situation. I'd been teaching for over 3 decades, and I'd developed pretty good instincts about when people were being deceptive or trying to manipulate me. This man's behavior and explanations weren't matching up with what I knew about official emergency procedures, and the facility didn't look or feel like any legitimate government shelter I'd ever heard of. I told the man I needed to get something from my car and that I'd be right back. But instead of going inside the building, I got in my car and started driving away from the compound as quickly as possible. In my rearview mirror, I could see several people coming out of the buildings and watching me leave. But no one tried to follow me or stop me from going. If this had been a real emergency shelter, I would have expected the staff to be more concerned about my safety and more persistent about getting me to stay. I drove back toward the interstate on the same route I'd taken to reach the compound. But now I was paying more attention to the details of the landscape and the road conditions. I didn't see any signs of approaching severe weather. No ice formation on the pavement, no wind or precipitation that would indicate the dangerous storm conditions described in the radio broadcast. The sky was still clear, and the temperature was holding steady in the low 30s, cold but not dangerous for driving. When I finally made it back to I-90, I turned on the radio to check for updated weather information and emergency broadcasts. But now the stations were playing normal programming, with no mention of severe weather warnings or highway closures in the area. I tried multiple stations and even checked the official emergency broadcast frequency, but there were no alerts or advisories about dangerous driving conditions anywhere in the region. I stopped at a truck stop about 50 miles west of where I'd taken the exit, and I asked other travelers and the staff if they'd heard anything about severe weather or emergency shelter procedures. None of them had received any weather warnings or emergency broadcasts, and the truck stop manager showed me current weather reports that predicted clear conditions for the next several days. He said there hadn't been any ice storms or dangerous weather in that area for several weeks. I called the Montana State Police to report what had happened and to ask about the emergency broadcast and the compound I'd been directed to visit. The dispatcher said they had no record of any emergency weather warnings or shelter activations in that area, and that the emergency broadcast system hadn't been used in the region for several months. She took my report and said they would investigate the location I described. But she warned me that there had been reports of fake emergency broadcasts being used to lure travelers to remote locations where they could be robbed or worse. I completed my drive to Seattle without any further incidents, but I spent the rest of the trip thinking about how sophisticated and convincing the fake emergency broadcast had been, and how many other travelers might have fallen for the same deception. The broadcast had sounded completely official and had included specific local information that suggested the people behind it had done extensive research about the area and the most effective ways to manipulate people into following their instructions. I never found out what would have happened if I'd stayed at that compound, or what the people there were planning to do to travelers who responded to their fake emergency broadcasts. But I learned that criminals can use official-sounding communications to exploit people's trust in authorities and their natural instinct to follow safety instructions during emergency situations. I now verify all emergency information through multiple sources before changing my travel plans, and I'm much more skeptical of unexpected advisories that direct me to unfamiliar locations, even when they sound legitimate and official. My name is Odin, and I'm 52 years old. Work as a social worker for the state of Pennsylvania, specializing in child protective services and family crisis intervention. I've been doing this work for almost 20 years now, which means I've seen more human suffering and trauma than most people could handle. But it also means I understand how childhood experiences can shape everything about who you become as an adult. What happened to me last spring during a routine drive back to my hometown for my high school reunion forced me to confront memories I'd spent 3 decades trying to forget. And it made me realize that sometimes the places we try to run from have a way of pulling us back when we least expect it. I grew up in a small town called Millerville in rural Pennsylvania. One of those places where everyone knows everyone else's business and nothing much changes from generation to generation. My childhood there wasn't particularly happy, for reasons I prefer not to discuss in detail. But it involved some very disturbing experiences with people I should have been able to trust. Experiences that led me to leave town the day I graduated from high school and never return for any significant period of time. I'd built a good life for myself in Pittsburgh, earned my degree in social work, and dedicated my career to helping other people escape from harmful situations. But I'd never dealt with my own past trauma in any meaningful way. When the invitation came for my 30th high school reunion, I initially threw it away because I had no interest in returning to Millerville or reconnecting with people from a period of my life that I'd worked hard to forget. But a few weeks later, I found myself thinking about it more and more, wondering if maybe it was time to face some old demons and prove to myself that I'd moved beyond the frightened teenager who'd fled from that town so many years ago. My therapist had been encouraging me to address some of the unresolved issues from my childhood, and I thought maybe attending the reunion would be a way to show myself that I was stronger now and couldn't be hurt by people or places that had traumatized me when I was young and vulnerable. I decided to make the drive on a Saturday morning in May, planning to attend the reunion that evening and then drive back to Pittsburgh on Sunday, spending as little time as possible in my hometown while still accomplishing what I hoped would be some kind of psychological closure. The drive from Pittsburgh to Millerville normally takes about 2.5 hours on familiar roads that I'd traveled many times over the years for work-related trips to other parts of the state, so I wasn't expecting any problems or complications during the journey. I left my apartment around 10 in the morning, feeling nervous, but determined to follow through with my plan to attend the reunion and confront whatever feelings might come up when I saw my hometown again after so many years. The weather was beautiful, sunny and warm, with the kind of spring day that makes you appreciate living in Pennsylvania when the winters finally end and everything starts growing again. I had my GPS set for the American Legion Hall where the reunion was being held, and I was listening to a podcast about trauma recovery that seemed appropriate for the psychological journey I was undertaking, along with the physical one. For the first hour and a half, everything proceeded normally. Just the familiar scenery of Pennsylvania countryside and small towns that I'd been seeing my entire life. But as I got closer to Millerville, I started noticing that the GPS was directing me to take routes I didn't recognize. back roads and secondary highways that didn't match the way I remembered getting to my hometown from Pittsburgh. I thought maybe construction or road improvements had changed the optimal route since my last visit several years earlier. So I followed the GPS instructions, even though the landscape was starting to look unfamiliar. The roads became increasingly narrow and winding, taking me through areas of dense forest and isolated farmland that seemed more remote and undeveloped than I remembered from my childhood exploration of the region. I was seeing fewer and fewer signs of modern life. No cell phone towers or recently built houses, no chain restaurants or gas stations that would indicate I was approaching a town of any significant size. The GPS kept insisting I was on the correct route, but my estimated arrival time kept changing, sometimes showing that I was still hours away from my destination despite having been driving in the right direction for over 2 hours. That's when I saw the house, and everything about the day took on a completely different meaning. It was sitting by itself at the end of a long dirt driveway, partially hidden behind overgrown trees and bushes. But I recognized it immediately, despite not having seen it for over 30 years. It was the house where some of the worst things from my childhood had happened, the place I'd spent years in therapy trying to forget, the location of experiences that had shaped my entire adult life and career choice, even though I'd never consciously acknowledged the connection. According to everything I knew about geography and local development, that house should have been torn down decades ago to make way for a shopping center that I'd heard was built on that site in the early 1990s. I'd specifically avoided driving past that area during my few previous visits to Millerville, because I didn't want to see the commercial development that had replaced the source of so many childhood nightmares. But there it was, exactly as I remembered it from when I was 12 years old. With the same peeling paint and crooked front porch and broken fence that had surrounded the property when I was too young to understand what was happening to me inside those walls. I pulled over and sat in my car, staring at the house and trying to understand how it could still exist when I was certain it had been demolished decades ago. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding in a way that reminded me of panic attacks I'd experienced in my 20s when I was first dealing with the trauma memories in therapy. I thought about just driving away and forgetting about the reunion. But something compelled me to get out of the car and walk closer to the house. Like I needed to prove to myself that it was real and not just some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and anxiety about returning to my hometown. As I walked up the driveway, I could see that the house was in exactly the same condition it had been 30 years ago, with the same broken windows and damaged roof and accumulated debris that had been there during my childhood. But there were also signs of recent activity. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt driveway and movement behind the curtained windows that suggested someone was currently living there. I heard voices coming from inside the house, adult voices having a conversation that I couldn't make out clearly, but that sounded familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. That's when I realized that the GPS hadn't malfunctioned or taken me on a detour to my reunion destination. It had deliberately brought me to this specific location, to this house that should have been gone, to face the people and experiences that I'd been running from for 30 years. The voices inside were getting louder, and I could hear footsteps approaching the front door, like whoever was inside had noticed my presence and was coming out to investigate or to invite me inside for a reunion of a very different kind. I ran back to my car as fast as I could and drove away from that property, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer, and my vision blurred by tears that I didn't realize I was crying. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that house and the voices I'd recognized from the worst period of my childhood. I drove for what felt like hours on roads that seemed to twist and wind through landscape that became increasingly surreal and dreamlike. Like I was moving through a geography that existed more in my memory than in physical reality. Eventually, I found myself on a familiar highway that led back toward Pittsburgh. And when I checked the time, I realized that somehow an entire day had passed, even though it felt like I'd only been driving for a couple of hours. It was already evening, and I'd missed the reunion completely. But I was more concerned about understanding what had happened and whether the house I'd seen was real or some kind of psychological manifestation of unresolved trauma that had been triggered by my decision to return to my hometown. I never made it to Millerville that day, and I never attended my high school reunion or any other event that would have required me to return to that area. When I got home to Pittsburgh, I spent hours researching online records and property databases to find out what had actually been built on the site where I remembered that house being located. According to every official source I could find, the property had indeed been purchased by a development company in 1991 and turned into a strip mall with a grocery store and several smaller retail businesses, exactly as I'd heard from other people who'd stayed in touch with Millerville news and gossip. But I know what I saw that day, and I know that somehow, in some way that I don't understand and can't explain rationally, I was brought face to face with a place and time from my past that I thought I'd left behind forever. Whether it was a psychological experience triggered by trauma memories or something more supernatural that allowed me to encounter a location that existed outside of normal time and space, it forced me to confront the reality that running away from painful experiences doesn't make them disappear, and that sometimes the only way to truly move forward is to face the things that scared you most as a child. I've continued working as a social worker, helping other people deal with trauma and abuse situations. But now I understand, in a much deeper way, how childhood experiences can follow you throughout your entire life, appearing when you least expect them and demanding that you finally acknowledge and process what happened to you. I never tried to return to Millerville again, and I probably never will. But I'm no longer running from my past in the same way I was before that strange and terrifying day when my GPS led me somewhere I was never supposed to go. If these 11 disturbing road trip stories have kept you on edge, make sure to subscribe to Verified Fears and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest horror compilations. Share your own terrifying travel experiences in the comments below. And remember to stay safe out there on those dark highways, because you never know what might be waiting for you around the next bend.